I need a wife, and you need a home. That's what the giant rancher said to the poor, obese Amish girl, words that silenced the dusty street outside the church. The bell tolled as whispers spread, and in one shocking moment, her fate was sealed. A lonely rancher, scarred by grief, and a girl cast aside by her own kin, now bound together in a covenant neither planned. But as their wagon rolls out of town, the danger begins. A greedy banker and the railroad want their river and will burn, lie, and destroy to take it. She's mocked as unfit. He's warned to give up but the truth of her past. And the fire of her faith may be the one thing that saves them both. Can a marriage born in desperation survive a war over water, betrayal, and cruel rumor? Or will this unlikely union crumble before love can take root? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from, hey? And if this story made you. Pause for a moment. Hit that subscribe button for more. The crisp autumn breeze swept across Ridgetop's Main Street, rustling the dried leaves that skittered along the dusty ground. Ronald McCord pulled his horse to a stop, his weathered face creasing in confusion at the unusual quiet. The stockyard, normally alive with the bustle of cattle trading, stood empty. Instead, a crowd had gathered near the whitewashed church steps. Their backs turned to him as they muttered amongst themselves. Ronald dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with a solid thud. At 6'4", he towered over most of the townspeople, allowing him to see what had captured their attention. There, huddled on the church steps, sat a young woman in plain Amish dress. Her figure was substantial, and she clutched a small carpet bag to her chest as if it contained all she had left in the world. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a quiet dignity despite the tears that threatened to spill. "Ain't worth the feed it'd take to keep her," someone in the crowd muttered, drawing cruel chuckles. "Forsaken by her own folk," another voice added. "Must be something wrong with her." Ronald's jaw tightened. He recognized several faces in the crowd, folks who'd shared his pews every Sunday, who'd brought food when fever took his Sarah and their baby boy 2 years past. Now here they stood, their Christian charity forgotten as they gawked at this woman's misfortune. The girl Patricia Yoder, he would later learn, trembled slightly in the morning chill. Her eyes remained fixed on her lap, her fingers working nervously at the worn fabric of her bag. Something in her quiet endurance of their cruelty stirred something deep in Ronald's chest. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Ronald found himself pushing through the crowd. His heavy steps on the church stairs drew Patricia's attention, and she looked up at him with startled brown eyes. They were kind eyes, he noticed, despite their fear, the sort of eyes that had seen hardship but hadn't let it harden them. "I need a wife," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "And you need a home." The crowd's whispers erupted anew, but Ronald paid them no mind. He kept his eyes on Patricia, watching as surprise and uncertainty played across her features. She studied him with careful consideration, no doubt weighing the risk of trusting a stranger. Against the certainty of abandonment, Reverend Matthews stepped forward from the church doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Brother McCord," he said slowly, "are you proposing marriage to this young woman?" Ronald nodded, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Yes, sir, I reckon I am." The Reverend turned to Patricia. "Miss Yoder, you understand you're under no obligation. We can find other arrangements." "What arrangements?" Ronald interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Let her be gawked at like a circus show. Ship her off to the poor farm." He looked back at Patricia. "I've got a good ranch, ma'am. 200 acres, running water, solid roof. It ain't fancy, but it's honest work and a decent home." Patricia's fingers tightened on her carpet bag. She spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "You don't know me, sir." "No," Ronald agreed. "But I know what it's like to stand alone." He held out his hand, calloused and strong. "I'm offering you a choice, nothing more." The Reverend cleared his throat. Marriage is a sacred covenant before God, not to be entered into lightly. Nothing light about it, Ronald responded. It's a proper proposal with proper intentions. He kept his hand extended, patient, letting Patricia decide. The crowd had grown larger now, and their whispers seemed to press in from all sides. Patricia glanced at them, then back at Ronald's steady hand. Something in her expression shifted, a flutter of hope breaking through her fear. "Yes," she whispered, placing her trembling hand in his. "I consent." Reverend Matthew studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come inside, then. We'll do this proper, with God as witness." The church interior was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. Ronald and Patricia stood before the altar, their shadows stretching long across the wooden floor as sunlight streamed through the high windows. The Reverend's words echoed in the nearly empty church, witnessed only by his wife and the church deacon. Patricia's "I do" was barely audible, but her hand remained steady in Ronald's as they exchanged simple vows. Ronald's own voice was gruff, but clear, promising to protect and provide, to honor and cherish. The plain brass ring he offered, purchased hastily from the general store while the Reverend prepared the papers, seemed to tremble slightly as he slipped it onto her finger. It was done when the papers were signed and the prayers said, Ronald led his new bride out to his wagon. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but curious faces still watched from the boardwalk and store windows. Ronald helped Patricia up onto the wagon bench, handling her with gentle respect despite her size. Her carpetbag containing all her worldly possessions sat between them as Ronald took up the reins. The sun was sinking toward the horizon as they left Ridgetop behind, painting the sky in sheets of gold and mox purple. Patricia sat straight-backed beside him, her hands folded in her lap, watching the vast Colorado plains roll out before them. The steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of wagon wheels filled the silence between them. In the distance, a single lamp burned in the window of Ronald's ranch house, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Patricia's eyes fixed on that small light, and Ronald wondered what she was thinking, what fears and hopes were running through her mind. He'd acted on impulse, moved by something he couldn't quite name, but now the weight of what they'd done settled over him like an evening fog. The wagon swayed gently as they crossed the shallow creek that marked the edge of his property. Ronald cleared his throat. "It ain't much to look at," he said, nodding toward the approaching house, "but it's solid built. Got a good well, and the garden plot's fertile, though it needs tending." Patricia nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I know how to tend a garden, Mr. McCord, and to keep a house." "Ronald," he corrected gently. "Reckon you should call me Ronald now." Her hands twisted slightly in her lap. "Ronald," she repeated, testing the name. Then, after a pause, "I'm Patricia." He nodded, slowing the horses as they approached the house. The lamplight spilled across the yard, catching the worn paint of the porch and the careful mending of the screen door. It wasn't much, as he'd said, but it was home, and now it would be hers too. For better or worse, as Ronald set the brake and prepared to help her down, Patricia spoke again, her voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its softness. "I won't be a burden to you," she said. "I know what people think when they look at me, but I'm strong enough to work, and I know my duty." Ronald turned to her, seeing the determination in her face, the dignity that no amount of cruel whispers had managed to strip away. "Never thought you'd be a burden," he said, quietly. "Saw something else in you back there, something worth standing." A flush colored Patricia's cheeks, and she ducked her head slightly. But Ronald caught the ghost of a smile tugging at her lips, and something in his chest loosened just a bit. They were strangers still, bound together by desperation and an impulse of kindness, but maybe that was enough of a foundation to build on. The evening wind rustled through the cottonwoods as Ronald helped Patricia down from the wagon. Her hand was warm in his, her step careful but determined as she took her first steps toward their shared future. The lamplight beckoned them home, and overhead, the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, silent witnesses to this unlikely beginning. The wagon creaked and swayed as Ronald guided the horses across the uneven prairie. Patricia held tight to the wooden seat, her body tensing with each jolt over rocks and ruts in the trail. The setting sun painted the sky in deep purples and golds, casting long shadows across the windswept grass. Ronald kept his eyes fixed ahead, his broad shoulders straight against the coming night. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the occasional snort from the horses. Patricia stole glances at her new husband's profile, trying to read anything in his stern expression as darkness crept across the land. Ronald pulled the wagon to a stop near a small copse of cottonwoods. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Too dark to travel safe now." Patricia nodded, grateful for the chance to ease her aching muscles. Ronald helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands careful and respectful despite her size. She smoothed her plain dress, conscious of the dust that had settled into every fold. Ronald moved with practiced efficiency, setting up a small camp. He hung a battered tin lantern from a low branch, its yellow light creating a small circle of warmth in the gathering dark. From his saddlebag, he produced a cloth-wrapped package. "Ain't much," he said, unwrapping cornbread and a tin of cold beans. "But it'll keep us till morning." Patricia settled herself on a fallen log, her hands folded in her lap. When Ronald handed her a tin plate, she bowed her head and began to pray softly. "Dear Lord, we thank thee for this bounty and for thy guidance. Bless this food to our use and us to thy service. Amen." Ronald had frozen in place, plate halfway to his mouth, watching her with surprise. Patricia felt heat rise in her cheeks but met his gaze steadily. After a moment, he nodded once and began to eat. The meal passed in silence. Prairie winds whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Patricia ate slowly, savoring each bite of the simple food. Her stomach had been too knotted with anxiety to eat much that morning, when her family's wagon had pulled away without her. After the meal, Ronald spread a blanket on the wagon bed for Patricia to sleep. She climbed up awkwardly, settling herself as best she could on the hard wooden planks. Above her, stars pricked through the velvet darkness, countless and cold. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every unfamiliar sound of the prairie night. When dawn finally broke, Patricia's bones ached from the cold and the unyielding wagon bed. She sat up slowly, working feeling back into her stiffened limbs. Ronald was already awake, tending to the horses. He acknowledged her with a nod, then began breaking camp with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the night before. Within minutes, they were back on the trail. The morning sun climbed higher as they traveled, burning away the dawn chill. Around mid-morning, Ronald pointed ahead. "There," he said. "That's home." Patricia leaned forward, studying the approaching ranch with careful eyes. A weather-beaten house stood alone against the sky, its timber walls gray with age, a barn listed to one side, its roof partially collapsed. The sight stirred something in her chestnut disappointment. Exactly, but a heavy awareness of the task ahead. Ronald brought the wagon to a stop before the house. Up close, Patricia could see missing shingles and a broken window pane patched. With canvas, the front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. "It ain't much," Ronald said again, echoing his words from the inn. His voice carried a defensive edge, as if expecting criticism. "It's shelter," Patricia replied softly. "That's not nothing." He helped her down from the wagon, then carried her carpet bag to the door. Patricia followed, her heart beating faster with each step. The door creaked open to reveal a single large room. The interior stopped her in her tracks. Dust lay thick on every surface. Dirty dishes were piled in a dry wash basin. A broken chair lay on its side in one corner, and cobwebs draped the window. Frames like tattered lace, the iron cooking stove stood cold and neglected, its surface rusted and ash-strewn. Ronald cleared his throat. "I ain't much for housekeeping," he said. That's partly why I need a wife. Someone to keep things proper." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "You'll have a roof over your head and food on the table. Protection too, though." "We don't get much trouble out here." Patricia nodded, swallowing against the shame that threatened to rise in her throat. She understood what was being offered what was expected. A business arrangement, nothing more. Board and shelter in exchange for domestic service. "Where should I sleep?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ronald gestured to an iron-framed bed in the far corner. Blankets were rumpled and gray with dust. "That's yours," he said. "I'll make up a place on the floor for myself." Patricia moved to the bed, setting her carpet bag down gently. With trembling fingers, she opened it, removing her spare dress, plain and black. Like the one she wore in her mother's Bible, the familiar leather binding was worn smooth with use, the pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. In the margins, holding the Bible close to her chest, Patricia whispered a prayer. "Lord, give me strength. Give me courage to face what lies ahead." Behind her, Ronald had begun to move about the room, gathering blankets for his makeshift bed. But at the sound of her prayer, he went still. When Patricia glanced back, she caught him turning away quickly, one hand rising to swipe roughly at his eyes. The moment passed as swiftly as it had come. Ronald cleared his throat again. "I'll see to the horses," he said gruffly, and strode out the door. Patricia watched him go, then turned back to the dusty room. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating years of neglecting possibility. Setting her Bible carefully on a shelf, she began rolling up her sleeves. The sound of Ronald's boots on the porch boards faded as he walked away. Patricia stood in the center of what was now her home, surrounded by dust and disorder, but standing straight and determined. She might have been abandoned by her family, might be bound now in a marriage of convenience to a stranger, but she still had her faith, her strength, and her dignity. Taking a deep breath, she whispered one more prayer. "Guide my hands, Lord. Help me make this house a home." Outside, the prairie wind continued its endless song, and the sun climbed higher in the Colorado sky. A new day had begun, bringing with it all the uncertainty and hope of new beginnings. Dawn broke over the Colorado prairie with golden fingers of light. Patricia woke to find Ronald already gone from his makeshift bed on the floor. Through the window, she could see him walking toward the barn, tools in hand. He had mentioned something about mending fences the night before. She rose slowly, mindful of her aching muscles from yesterday's long journey. The house looked no better in the morning light, if anything. The sunshine revealed even more dust and disorder than she'd noticed the evening before, but Patricia squared her shoulders, drew a deep breath, and set to work. First, she needed hot water, lots of it. The iron pump outside creaked in protest as she worked the handle, filling 2 large buckets. Her arms trembled with the weight as she carried them inside, water sloshing over her shoes. The old cook stove took some figuring out, but soon she had a fire going, heating water for cleaning. "One thing at a time," she whispered to herself, her mother's favorite saying. The magnitude of the task before her threatened to overwhelm. Cobwebs draped every corner like gray lace. Dust lay thick enough to write in, and dirty dishes formed precarious towers in the dry wash basin. But Patricia had been raised to face challenges head-on with prayer and perseverance. She started with the dishes, heating water and adding precious soap shavings. From her carpetbag, as she scrubbed, she hummed an old hymn, letting its familiar melody calm her racing thoughts. Each clean plate felt like a small victory. Next came the sweeping. Dust billowed up in clouds as her broom disturbed years of settled dirt. Patricia had to pause several times, coughing and wiping her streaming eyes. She opened the windows too. Let in fresh air, though the morning was still cool. In a corner, she found a bundle of rags that might once have been dishcloths. After boiling them clean, she put them to work on the windows. Gradually, grimy panes gave way to clear glass, letting in more of the strengthening sunlight. By mid-morning, Patricia's back ached fiercely, but she pressed on. The physical labor helped keep her mind from darker thoughts, her family's wagon disappearing over the horizon. The cruel whispers of townspeople, the uncertainty of her future with this silent, haunted man. In her carpetbag, she had packed a small pouch of yeast and some flour, precious supplies she'd been determined not to leave behind. Now she cleared a space on the newly cleaned table and set about mixing bread dough. The familiar motions of kneading brought comfort, and soon the smell of rising bread began to fill the house. While the dough rose, Patricia tackled the cook stove, scrubbing away layers of grease and ash. She found an old coffee pot behind the stove and spent nearly an hour getting it clean enough to use. The thought of offering Ronald fresh coffee with his supper gave her a small spark of satisfaction. By noon, the house had undergone a remarkable transformation. Surfaces gleamed, windows sparkled, and the first loaf of fresh bread sat cooling on the table. The rich, yeasty smell filled every corner, replacing the musty odor that had pervaded the house before Patricia had just finished hanging the last of the cleaned rags to dry when she heard boots on the porch. Ronald stepped inside and stopped, dead, his eyes widening as he took in the changed room. "I hope you don't mind," Patricia said quickly, suddenly uncertain. "I thought the house needed some attention." Ronald stood silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the clean windows to the organized shelves to the bread on the table. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Smells good," he said gruffly. Patricia felt her cheeks warm at this simple compliment. "Would you like some? It should be cool enough to cut now." He nodded, and she bustled to slice the bread, spreading it with a little butter she'd found in the root cellar. Ronald ate 2 pieces standing up, nodding his approval with each bite. "Been a while since I had fresh bread," he admitted. "I can bake every day if you'd like," Patricia offered. "And I found some coffee. Would you like a cup with supper?" Another nod, and then he was gone again, back to his fence mending. But Patricia felt a small glow of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The afternoon passed in more cleaning and organizing. Patricia found herself talking softly to the empty house as she worked, sharing memories of her mother's lessons in homemaking. "A clean home lifts the spirit," she murmured, remembering her mother's words. "And every task done with love makes a house more of a home." When Ronald returned at dusk, supper was waiting. Beans and salt pork she'd found in the pantry, served with more fresh bread and hot coffee. They ate in silence for a while, but Patricia gathered her courage and spoke. "Softly, might I ask, have you lived here long?" Ronald paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "All my life was my father's place before mine." Patricia nodded, carefully breaking her bread into small pieces. "It's good land," she offered. "I saw the creek when we drove in yesterday." "Good. Water," Ronald agreed. "Never runs dry, even in summer." He fell silent again, but something in his expression encouraged Patricia to try once more. "And have you always been alone here?" The silence stretched so long she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then Ronald set down his cup with deliberate care. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Had a wife once, and a baby girl. His eyes fixed on something distant, seeing things Patricia couldn't. Fever took them both 3 years ago. They're buried. Up on the hill, Patricia's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ronald pushed back from the table abruptly. "Need to check the horses," he muttered, and strode out into the gathering dark. Patricia sat alone at the table, her own supper forgotten. The weight of grief in this house was almost tangible, like another presence sharing the room with them. But instead of feeling discouraged, she felt her resolve strengthen. This sorrowful place needed more than just cleaning. It needed warmth, light, life. Rising from the table, she found the lamp she'd cleaned earlier and filled it with oil. With careful movements, she placed it in the window facing the barn, its gentle light pushing back against the prairie darkness through the window. She could see Ronald's figure moving in the barn doorway. He had stopped whatever he was doing and stood very still, looking toward the house, toward the lamps. Welcoming glow. Every home should look lived in, Patricia said softly to herself, remembering how her mother had always lit a lamp at dusk. Every home should have a light to guide its people home. In the barn, Ronald watched the lamplight spilling across the yard. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name, or perhaps didn't want to. It had been so long since that window had held any light. So long since the house had felt like more than just walls and a roof. The lamp burned steady and bright, like a star brought down to earth. Like hope, perhaps, though Ronald had all but forgotten what hope felt like. He turned back to his tasks, but found his eyes drawn again and again to that gentle light, calling him home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Ronald hitched his team to the wagon. Patricia watched from the porch, nervously smoothing her plain dress. Yesterday's cleaning had revealed how bare the pantry was, making this trip to town necessary, though she dreaded facing those who had witnessed her abandonment just 2 days ago. "Ready?" Ronald called, his voice gruff, but not unkind. He held out a calloused hand to help her climb up to the wagon seat. Patricia took a deep breath and accepted his help, trying not to feel self-conscious as the wagon dipped under her weight. The wooden seat creaked as she settled herself, clutching her worn carpet bag that now held the few coins Ronald had given her for supplies. They rode in companionable silence, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm against the packed dirt road. The morning air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass, and Patricia found herself relaxing slightly, drinking in the vast landscape that was now her home. As they approached Ridgetop, Patricia's anxiety returned. The town looked different in the morning light, less threatening than it had that terrible afternoon, but still full of watching eyes. Ronald guided the wagon down the main street, past the church where they'd exchanged hasty vows, and pulled up in front of the mercantile. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods. A bell tinkled above the door as they entered, and Patricia felt the weight of stairs immediately. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the list she'd carefully written. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, soap. "Look who's back," a woman's voice carried clearly across the store, pitched just loud enough to be heard. The giant and his large bride. Patricia's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to continue examining the shelf of dried beans. Ronald's presence behind her felt like a solid wall, protective and stern. "Reckon that wagon springs are getting quite a test," another voice added with a snicker. Ronald's jaw tightened visibly. His hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing, following Patricia as she moved methodically through her list. She could feel the tension radiating from him, like heat from a stove. The storekeeper, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, at least treated them professionally, though his eyes widened slightly when Patricia requested 20 pounds of flour. "Planning to do some baking, I see," he commented neutrally. "Yes, sir," Patricia replied softly. A home needs fresh bread. As Ronald paid for their supplies, raised voices from outside Dr. Ooh, their attention. A crowd had gathered near the bank, where a well-dressed man stood on the steps, gesturing emphatically. Progress waits for no man. The man was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the mercantile's front window. The railroad sawmill will bring prosperity to all of Ridgetop. Patricia noticed Ronald go completely still, his expression darkening. They stepped outside, their arms full of wrapped packages, and listened. The man on the steps was Ezra Langley, the banker. His suit was Eastern cut, his boots polished to a shine that seemed at odds with the dusty street. The river's power will drive our future, he proclaimed. The railroad's engineers have already drawn up the plans. Construction begins next month. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone called out, "What about the ranches downstream? They depend on that water." Langley's smile didn't reach his eyes. Arrangements will be made. Progress requires sacrifice, friends. We can't let a few reluctant ranchers hold back the march of civilization. Ronald's face had turned to stone. Patricia could see a muscle working in his jaw as he loaded their supplies into the wagon. He helped her up to the seat without a word, but his movements were sharp with anger. They were halfway out of town when Patricia finally gathered the courage to ask, "The river they spoke of, is that your water source?" Ronald's hands tightened. "On the Rains, creek that runs through my land feeds from it. Been water rights attached to that ranch since my father's time." His voice was low, controlled, but Patricia could hear the worry beneath the anger. Without it, nothing grows. Cattle die. Land dies. Patricia twisted her hands in her lap. "Perhaps we should pray about it. Surely God honors rightful ownership." Ronald gave a bitter laugh. "God ain't the one making these decisions, Miss Patricia. It's men like Langley, with their fancy papers and railroad money. They own the law in these parts. But surely there must be something. I've seen it before." Ronald cut her off. "Railroad wants something, railroad takes it. Man can fight." But he trailed off, staring at the distant hills. They rode in heavy silence for several miles. The wagon swayed gently, and Patricia found herself watching the countryside with new eyes, imagining it parched and dying. The thought made her heart ache as they approached the ranch. A figure appeared. On the trail ahead, a woman standing straight and dignified despite her years. Her dress was a mixture of traditional Ute garments and settler clothing, and she held up a hand in greeting as they approached. "Marita," Ronald said softly to Patricia. "Known her since I was a boy. She's good people." He pulled the wagon to a stop, and Marita approached. Her face was lined with wisdom and concern. "I heard the talk in town," she said, without preamble. "The railroad men, they were at the river yesterday, making their marks on trees." Ronald nodded grimly. "Langley was crowing about it this morning." "This will bring trouble," Marita said, her dark eyes serious. "Already, young men talk of fighting. Both your people and mine, we cannot live without the river's life." Patricia saw Ronald's shoulders tense. "I won't let them take it without a fight," Kay said quietly. Marita's gaze shifted to Patricia, studying her with keen interest. "You are new here," she said, "but already caught in our troubles. I am sorry for this. Welcome to our valley." "I'm Patricia," she offered shyly. "Ronald's wife." Something like approval flickered in Marita's eyes. "Good. He has been too long alone." She turned back to Ronald. "Be careful, friend. Railroad men carry more than just papers. They bring guns and cruel hearts." "I know," Ronald said grimly. "But this land is all I have. All my father had. I can't just let them steal it." Marita nodded slowly. "Then we will all fight in our own ways." She touched her hand to her heart, then extended it toward them, a gesture of solidarity that needed no translation. "Watch the signs. I will bring word if I hear more." They watched her walk away, her straight figure gradually blending into the landscape. Patricia felt shaken by the morning's events, the weight of this new threat settling heavy on her shoulders. Yet somehow, Marita's quiet strength had kindled something in her, a determination to face whatever came. Ronald clicked to the horses, and they started moving again. Just before they crested the last hill toward home, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "Been defending this land all my life. Reckon I'll keep on doing it till they put me in the ground." Patricia looked at his profile, seeing the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm gently. "You're not alone anymore," she said quietly. He glanced at her, surprised, then gave a short nod. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a silence that felt somehow different, less lonely, more shared. Above them, a red-tailed hawk circled slowly, watching over the threatened valley as the wagon made its way home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Ronald shouldered his shovel. Patricia watched from the doorway as he headed toward the irrigation ditches, his tall frame moving with purpose through the golden light. She had risen early to fix him a hearty breakfast of cornbread and bacon, determined to prove her worth through more than just keeping house. The chickens needed feeding, so Patricia gathered her skirts and made her way to the small coop Ronald had repaired days earlier. The hens clucked and scratched as she scattered feed, their peaceful sounds matching the rhythm of her heart. This simple task brought her joy. These creatures didn't judge her size or whisper cruel words. They simply accepted the care she offered. Beyond the chicken coop, she had started a modest garden. The soil was hard-packed from neglect, but Patricia worked it carefully each day, turning earth and pulling weeds. She had planted carrots, beans, and potatoes, sturdy vegetables that could withstand the harsh climate. As she worked the rows, she could see Ronald in the distance, his shovel rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he deepened the irrigation channels. When the sun reached its peak, Patricia wrapped some bread and cheese in a clean cloth and filled a jug with cool well water. Her feet knew the path now, and she made her way carefully toward where Ronald worked. The sound of his labored breathing and the scrape of his shovel grew louder as she approached. "I thought you might want some dinner," she called softly, using the midday meal's proper name as she'd learned was custom out here. Ronald straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Much obliged," he said, setting his shovel aside. His eyes held surprise, as they often did when she showed him these small kindnesses. They sat together on the bank of the ditch, sharing the simple meal in companionable silence. Patricia watched how the water moved through the channels Ronald had dug, catching sunlight like liquid silver. "How far does the water need to reach?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Ronald pointed toward the distant pastures. "To keep the grass growing for the cattle clear out to those far hills. Every drop counts, especially come high summer." His voice grew tight. "If Langley and his railroad friends get their way?" Patricia nodded, understanding growing in her heart. This wasn't just about water. It was about survival, about a way of life. She gathered her courage and spoke. Would you show me? How it all works, I mean. The water flow and such." Ronald looked at her with surprise, then consideration. "Reckon I could, this evening, if you've a mind. Light stays long enough now." Patricia smiled, pleased he'd agreed. "I'll have supper ready early then." The rest of the afternoon passed in its familiar pattern, Patricia tending to household tasks while Ronald's shovel rang against stones and earth. As the sun began its slow descent, she stirred a pot of beef stew, adding the last of their carrots and potatoes. The rich aroma filled the small house, and when Ronald came in to wash up, she saw his appreciative glance toward the pot. They ate quietly, but it was a different kind of quiet than those first awkward days. Patricia had learned that Ronald wasn't. A man of many words, but his silence held comfort now rather than distance. When he finished his second bowl, she took a deep breath. "Shall we walk the ditches now?" Ronald nodded, rising from his chair. "Best bring a shawl." Evening airs still got bite to it. Outside, the sky had turned to purple and gold, painting the ranch in soft colors. Ronald led the way along the main irrigation channel, his steps sure and measured so Patricia could keep pace. At various points, he stopped to explain how smaller ditches branched off to water different fields, how the grade of the land affected water flow, and how he managed the simple gates he'd built. To control it, Patricia listened intently, asking questions that showed she grasped the importance of each detail. When they reached a wider section, Ronald knelt down and used a stick to draw in the dirt, showing how Langley's planned diversion upstream would affect their water supply. "They take that much from the river, won't be enough flow to reach half. Our land," he explained, his voice grave. "Can't keep cattle without grass, can't grow crops without water." Patricia stood quiet for a moment, watching the current ripple past their feet. "The townsfolk," she said slowly, "they don't understand what this means, do they? They hear fine words about progress and prosperity." "Langley's good with words," Ronald agreed bitterly. "Better than me, that's certain, but words aren't truth," Patricia said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is truth, this land, these ditches, the crops and cattle that feed people." She turned to face him directly. "I may be new here, and the town may not want me, but I want to help fight for this ranch, Ronald. It's my home now, too." Ronald stared at her, clearly taken aback by her declaration. The silence stretched between them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Reckon you've got more grit than folks give you credit for, Miss Patricia." "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said quietly, "or of standing up for what's right. My size may make some things difficult, but it doesn't make me worthless." "No," Ronald said slowly, "it surely doesn't." He looked out over the land, then back at her. "If you mean to stand with me in this fight, I won't tell you no. Truth is, I've been alone against them too long already." Patricia felt warmth bloom. In her chest, pride and gratitude mixing together. "Thank you," she whispered. They walked back to the house as true darkness settled over the ranch. Patricia lit the lamp and took up her mending, settling into the chair by the window. The familiar motion of needle and thread soothed her, and she, med softly as she worked. Ronald sat at the table, supposedly reviewing his cattle ledger, but Patricia could feel his gaze on her from time to time. She didn't look up, giving him the privacy to study her as he wished. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over them both, making the room feel smaller and safer and safer. As she sewed, Patricia thought about the day, about Ronald taking time to teach her, about the trust implied in sharing his fears for the ranch. She thought about how different it felt from those first days when they had been little more than strangers bound by desperate choices. When Ronald finally rose to prepare for bed, she heard him pause near her chair. "You did good work today," he said quietly. "With the chickens, and the garden rows are straight as any I've seen." Patricia looked up, meeting his eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded and moved away, spreading his blanket on the floor, as he had every night since she arrived. But something had shifted between them, something fundamental. As Patricia watched him settle down for sleep, she realized that he was seeing her differently now, not as a burden he'd taken on out of pity, but as a partner who chose to stand beside him. The lamp burned low as Patricia finished her mending. In its fading light, she watched Ronald's chest rise and fall in sleep, his face relaxed and somehow younger. For the first time since being left on those church steps, she felt truly at peace with where she was. This hard land, this quiet man, this life of work and worry. It was home now. And she would fight to protect it. She blew out the lamp and made her way to bed, her heart full of quiet determination. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she would face them with the same courage she'd found today. The ranch had given her a purpose, and Ronald had given her respect. It was more than enough to build on. A week of autumn winds had painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson when Patricia gathered her courage to speak up at breakfast. She had been thinking about this since their walk along the irrigation ditches, turning an idea over and over in her mind like a worried stone. "I want to go with you to town today," she said, setting a plate of fresh biscuits on the table. To the county clerk's office. Ronald paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "It's a long ride, Patricia. 4 hours each way at least." "I know." She settled into her chair, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I've been thinking about those water rights. Sometimes fresh eyes see what others might miss." Ronald studied her face across the table, his expression thoughtful. The morning sunlight streaming through the window caught the silver at his temples, and Patricia found herself noticing how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was deep in thought. Finally, he nodded. "Reckon you've earned the right to try. We'll leave after the morning chores." Patricia hurried through her tasks, feeding the chickens and setting bread to rise for their return. She changed into her best dress, still plain and worn, but clean and pressed. When she stepped outside, Ronald had already hitched the wagon and was loading extra blankets for the journey. The morning air held a bite that promised winter wasn't far off. Patricia settled onto the wagon bench, grateful for the thick quilt Ronald draped across their laps. As they set off, the wagon wheels creaking familiar rhythms. She watched their small house disappear behind them. The journey was long, but Patricia found herself enjoying it more than she expected. The countryside spread out before them in autumn. Splendor and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves made a soothing backdrop to their occasional conversations. Ronald pointed out landmarks, an old Indian burial ground they passed respectfully, the lightning-struck tree where travelers often rested, the distant mountains that marked the edge of his grazing land. "My father named every hill on this route," he said, surprising her with the voluntary sharing of memory. "Said a man should know his land like he knows his own face." Patricia smiled. "My father was the same with his fields, though we had far less land. He named each acre for the Bible story it reminded him of." It was nearly noon when they reached town. The streets were busy with wagons and riders, and Patricia felt the familiar stares following them. But today, she held her head high. She had purpose here, and no amount of whispers could take that from her. The county clerk's office was a small brick building next to the courthouse. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Water rights documentation," he wheezed. "That'll be in the back room. Might take some time to find anything specific." "We'll wait," Ronald said firmly. The clerk led them to a room lined with shelves of leather-bound ledgers and stacked papers. A small table with 2 chairs sat in the center, lamplight casting yellow pools on its scarred surface. "Start with 1868, the clerk suggested, pulling down several heavy books. "That's when most claims were filed." Patricia settled at the table, smoothing her skirts with determined hands. "I'll start with these," she said, reaching for the first ledger. "You take those newer ones, Ronald." For the next 2 hours, they searched page after page of spidery handwriting, land descriptions, and legal terms that made Patricia's eyes ache. The clerk brought them water once, then left them to their task. Outside, the afternoon sun crept across the sky. Patricia was halfway through her 4th ledger when something caught her eye. It was tucked between pages recording cattle brands, a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Her heart began to pound as she read. "Ronald," she whispered, "come look at this." He moved to stand behind her chair, his shadow falling across the page. Patricia's finger traced the lines of text. It's a water claim filed by James McCord in 1863. That was your father, wasn't it? Ronald leaned closer, his breath warm near her ear. Yes, he said hoarsely. That's his signature, right there. The clerk hurried over at Ronald's call. After examining the document through his spectacles, he nodded slowly. This is a valid claim, filed and recorded proper. Predates any other claims on that water by near 15 years, including Ezra Langley's railroad claim. Patricia asked. Including that, the clerk confirmed. This here's the senior water right. Law's clear. On that point, Ronald's hand found Patricia's shoulder, squeezing gently. She reached up to cover it with her own, feeling the tremor in his fingers. They had done it. They had found the proof they needed. The clerk made an official copy of the document, signing and sealing it with proper ceremony. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Patricia saw Ronald standing straighter, as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. The ride home seemed shorter, somehow. Golden light slanted across the prairie, setting the autumn leaves aflame. A cool breeze carried the scent of distant snow, but Patricia felt warm inside and out. Tell me about your father, she said softly, as they crossed a shallow creek. The man who had the foresight to file those water rights. Ronald was quiet for a moment, but when he spoke, his voice held warmth she hadn't heard before. He was a dreamer, but a practical one. Came out here with nothing but a wagon of tools and a head full of plans. Said he could see the ranch that would be right from the start. Like you can see it now, Patricia observed. Ronald glanced at her, surprised, then chuckled. Reckon so. He paused, then asked, What about your childhood? What made you smile back then? Patricia found herself sharing stories of helping her mother bake pies for church suppers, of learning to quilt during long winter evenings, of the time she'd tried to teach a calf to follow her like a dog. To her delight, Ronald laughed at that, a real laugh that crinkled his eyes and showed his teeth. She joined in, and suddenly they were both laughing, sharing memories back and forth as the wagon rolled homeward. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, startling a pair of meadowlarks into flight. It was nearly dark when they reached the ranch. While Ronald tended to the horses, Patricia hurried inside to check her bread, risen perfectly, and then set about preparing a celebration supper. She had been saving a plump chicken for a special occasion, and this surely qualified. Soon the house filled with savory smells, roasted chicken, sage dressing, gravy made from the drippings. Patricia hummed as she worked, her heart light with their victory and the memory of Ronald's laughter. When Ronald came in from the barn, stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The table was set with their best dishes, a lamp burning cheerfully at its center. Patricia had even found a few late wildflowers to put in a jar. Smells like heaven itself, he said softly. They sat down together, and Patricia said grace, adding a special thanks for their discovery. The food tasted better than usual, seasoned with success and shared joy. Ronald took seconds of everything, praising her cooking with more words than she'd heard him use in days. After the dishes were done, they sat by lamplight, comfortable in their shared quiet. Patricia took up her mending, and Ronald opened his ledger, but neither seemed to focus much on their tasks. Every now and then, their eyes would meet across the room, and they would share a smile, small, private things that made the house feel warmer. The empty corners that had seemed so stark when Patricia first arrived were filled now with the gentle sounds of home. The crackle of the stove, the tick of the clock, the soft whisper of needle through fabric. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the distance, an owl answered. Patricia looked up from her sewing to find Ronald watching her, his expression soft in the lamplight. Their victory today had changed something between them, she realized. The water rights document wasn't just proof of their claim to the river. It was proof that they could face challenges together. That her presence in his life could bring more than just clean dishes and hot meals. The days that followed their victory at the county clerk's office brought a gentle rhythm to the ranch. Each morning, Patricia woke before dawn to kindle the stove and start the day's bread. The familiar task of kneading dough centered her, and soon the house filled with the warm, yeasty smell that made even Ronald linger over breakfast. Through the kitchen window, she could watch him working on the barn. He'd started with the roof, replacing rotted shingles and strengthening the beams. The sound of his hammer echoed across the yard, steady as a heartbeat. Sometimes he would catch her watching and lift a hand in greeting, a gesture that never failed to warm her cheeks. One crisp morning, as Patricia hung laundry on the line, she spotted a figure approaching on foot. It was Marita, the Ute woman who had warned them about the railroad. She carried a bundle wrapped in soft leather, her long dark hair gleaming in the autumn sun. "Welcome," Patricia called out, remembering Ronald's words about Marita being a good neighbor. "Would you like some coffee?" Marita's smile was gentle. "That would be kind," she said, her English clear and measured. "I bring herbs to share, sage for cleansing, yarrow for healing." Inside, Patricia poured coffee into her best cups while Marita unwrapped her bundle on the table. The herbs filled the kitchen with sharp green scents that reminded Patricia of mountain winds. As they sipped their coffee, Marita explained each plant's purpose, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke. "This one," she said, holding up a sprig of silvery leaves, "my grandmother used to ease winter coughs. And these berries, dried now, make tea for strength." Patricia listened intently, asking questions about storage and preparation. "Would you teach me more?" she asked. "I know so little about the plants here." Marita's dark eyes studied her face. "You have a good heart for learning," she said finally. "Yes, I will teach you. But first, tell me about your people's ways. I see you work with cloth." She nodded toward Patricia's quilting basket. "Oh," Patricia brightened. "Yes, I'm making a quilt for winter. Would you like to see?" She spread the unfinished quilt on the table, simple squares in blues and browns, like the Colorado sky meeting. "Earth." Marita ran her fingers over the stitches admiringly. "In my tribe, we tell stories with patterns too," she said. "Different designs mean different things. Mountains, rivers, the paths our ancestors walked. Would you show me?" Patricia asked eagerly. She cleared space at the table and brought out her sewing supplies. That was how Ronald found them, an hour later when he came in for water, heads bent together over fabric and thread, Marita demonstrating a traditional pattern while Patricia tried to copy it. The sound of their quiet laughter made him pause in the doorway. "Joining a sewing circle?" he asked, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Marita is teaching me Ute patterns," Patricia explained, "and I'm showing her how we piece quilts. Come see." To her surprise, Ronald did come closer, studying the designs with genuine interest. "Reminds me of something my father saw once," he said slowly. "On a trading trip up north, said the patterns told stories that went back generations." Marita nodded. "Your father, he understood respect," she said. "He always asked permission before crossing our hunting grounds. Unlike these railroad men." Ronald's face darkened at the mention of the railroad, but Patricia quickly spoke up. "Tell us about your father's trading trips, Ronald. I'd love to hear those stories." He hesitated, then pulled up a chair. "Well, there was this one time, must have been 1865 or so. Pa was driving cattle up to Wyoming. The afternoon light slanted golden through the windows as Ronald shared tales of his father's adventures, cattle drives through thunderstorms, negotiations with tribal leaders, nights spent watching the stars wheel overhead. Marita added her own stories of how the land had looked before the settlers came. Speaking of vast herds of buffalo and ancient trading routes, Patricia's hands stayed busy with her quilting as she listened, but her heart was full. This, she realized, was what she'd always longed for, not just a roof over her head, but a true home filled with shared stories and laughter. As the sun began to set, Marita rose to leave. "I will come again," she promised, gathering her remaining herbs. "There is much more to teach about the plants, and I want to see how your quilt grows." Patricia walked her to the door, impulsively hugging the older woman. After a moment's surprise, Marita returned the embrace. "You bring life back to this place," she murmured. "It has been too long dark here." After Marita left, Patricia began preparing supper, a hearty stew with dumplings and the last of the summer vegetables. Ronald had returned to the barn, but she could see him through the window, silhouetted against the dying light as he measured boards for new stalls. The moon was rising, full and bright, when Ronald finally came in. He washed up at the pump, then sat down at the table, where a bowl of stew waited, still warm from the back of the stove. "This is mighty fine," he said, after several bites. Then, setting down his spoon, he added quietly, "Everything you do here is mighty fine, Patricia. I want you to know that." Patricia felt tears spring to her eyes. She turned quickly to the stove, pretending to check the banked fire, but Ronald's words had struck deep. All her life, she'd been told she wasn't enough. Too big, too plain, too much of a burden. But here, in this house that had known such sorrow, she was wanted. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice with more. After the dishes were done, they stepped out onto the porch together. The full moon painted everything in silver, making the prairie look like a sea of light. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant wood smoke. They stood side by side, not speaking, watching the moonlight play across the land that was theirs to protect. Ronald's hand rested on the porch rail, inches from Patricia's. For a long moment, she thought he might reach for her, and her heart beat faster at the possibility. But the moment passed, both of them retreating into shy silence. Still, something had shifted between them, as subtle and significant as the changing of seasons. Like the bread dough rising in her kitchen or the new boards in the barn, hope was taking shape, slow, steady, and sure. Patricia glanced at Ronald's profile, strong and thoughtful in the moonlight. He seemed softer somehow, the grief carved. Lines around his mouth less deep. When he caught her looking, he didn't turn away, but offered a small smile that warmed her right down to her toes. They stayed on the porch until the evening chill drove them inside, each carrying the memory of that shared silence like a treasured secret. As Patricia banked the fire for the night, she heard Ronald humming softly as he arranged his bedroll, an old hymn her mother used to sing. The sound followed her into sleep, a gentle reminder that she was home at last, truly home, where love was beginning to bloom as naturally as Marita's herbs in the wild. Prairie soil. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Ronald and Patricia hitched up the wagon for their monthly supply run into Ridgetop. Patricia had made a careful list: flour for baking, coffee, sugar, and thread for her quilting. The air held autumn's crisp bite, promising winter wasn't far off. "Best get an early start," Ronald said, helping Patricia onto the wagon seat. Storms brewing up north. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, but something else darkened Patricia's heart as they approached town. She couldn't name it, but tensions seemed to crackle in the air like lightning waiting to strike. The wagon wheels creaked over the rutted main street. Patricia noticed immediately how people turned away as they passed. Mothers hurried their children. Inside shops, men suddenly found their boot tips fascinating. The usual friendly waves were conspicuously absent outside the mercantile. Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, saw Patricia and quickly crossed the street, clutching her shawl tight as if Patricia carried some disease. The action struck Patricia like a physical blow. "Something's wrong," she whispered to Ronald. His jaw tightened as he tied the horses. "Pay it no mind," he said, but his eyes scanned the street warily. Inside the mercantile, the usual cheerful chatter died as they entered. Patricia felt the weight of stairs on her back as she moved between the shelves, gathering their supplies. Whispers followed in her wake, falling silent when she turned. "Shameful business," she caught one woman muttering. "No wonder they cast her out," came another whisper. Patricia's hands trembled as she selected a bag of flour. Ronald stood protective at her shoulder, his presence both comforting and somehow inadequate against the tide of silent judgment washing over them. Mr. Phillips. The store owner wouldn't meet her eyes as he tallied their purchases. His wife stood in the doorway to their living quarters, lips pressed thin with disapproval. "That'll be $3.25. Phillips said to the counter rather than to them. As Ronald counted out the money, the bell above the door chimed. Ezra Langley stepped in, immaculate in his banker's suit. His smile was razor-sharp. "Why, if it isn't the McCords," he said, voice carrying to every corner of the store. "I trust you're well, Mrs. McCord. Though perhaps I shouldn't call you that, given the circumstances of your departure from your previous community." Patricia felt the blood drain from her face. Ronald's hand clenched on the counter. What circumstances would those be, Langley? Ronald's voice was dangerous. "Oh, merely what I heard from some travelers passing through." Langley examined his fingernails. Quite the scandal, apparently. Something about improper relations with multiple young men. Tisk. No wonder your Amish elders saw fit to remove you. The lie struck Patricia like a slap. She swayed, grabbing the counter for support. The store had gone deadly quiet. "That's a lie," she whispered, but her voice shook. "Is it?" Langley raised an eyebrow. "I merely repeat what I heard. Though it does explain the hasty marriage, doesn't it? Quite charitable of you, McCord, taking in such a troubled woman." Ronald moved so fast, Patricia barely saw it. One moment. He was beside her. The next he had Langley by the lapels, shoving him against the wall. Cans clattered from shelves. "Ronald, no!" Patricia cried. "Say that again," Ronald growled. "Say one more word about my wife." Langley's smile never wavered. "Careful, McCord. Assault is a serious crime. Though I understand defending a wife's honor is important to you. Even if she doesn't deserve it, get out." Ronald's voice was barely human. "Get out before I forget I'm a Christian man." He released Langley, who straightened his jacket with exaggerated care. "Good day to you both," he said pleasantly. "Oh, and do think about my offer regarding those water rights. Things might become difficult otherwise." The bell chimed again as he left. The store remained silent as a tomb. Patricia gathered their purchases with trembling hands, refusing to look at anyone. Ronald carried the heavy items to the wagon while she followed with smaller parcels. She could feel the town's eyes on them. Through every window, they were halfway home before Patricia's control finally broke. A sob escaped her, then another. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back the flood, but it was no use. Years of bearing cruel judgment, of trying to be worthy of prayers for acceptance, it all poured out in harsh, racking cries. Ronald drew the wagon to a halt. For a long moment, he sat silent beside her, hands tight on the reins. "None of it's true," Patricia choked out. I wouldn't. I know." Ronald said quietly, "I know you wouldn't." "Then why?" She wiped her eyes with her apron. Why would he say such things? Why did they believe him? Ronald's face was grim, because Langley knows tongues are sharper than knives. Because he thinks he can drive us away, force me to sell. Because people would rather believe an ugly lie than look for the truth. He turned to her. "But I promise you this, his lies will not stand. I won't let them, Patricia nodded, trying to gather her strength. "I'm sorry I'm not stronger." "Don't." Kayla's voice was fierce. "Don't apologize for their cruelty." They rode the rest of the way in silence. Storm clouds had moved in, matching their mood. By the time they reached the ranch, fat drops were falling. That evening, after a quiet supper, Patricia knelt beside her bed as she did every night. But tonight, her prayers poured out loud and urgent in the lamplight. "Lord, give me strength to bear this burden," she whispered. "Help me endure their scorn with grace. Show me how to forgive those who believe lies about me. And please, please let the truth come to light." Her voice broke. "I know I'm not what most would choose for a wife. I know my size makes people judge me. But you made me as I am, and I try to serve you faithful. Help me be worthy of this home you've given me. Help me be worthy of." She glanced toward Ronald's blanket on the floor, then quickly looked away. Ronald lay still, but he was awake, every word sinking deep into his heart. He'd lost his own faith when fever took his first. Wife and child, grief had hardened him, made him forget the comfort of prayer. But listening to Patricia's quiet devotion, he felt something crack open inside him. Here was strength greater than his own, not in muscle or might, but in steadfast faith. While he'd raged against loss, she'd learned to lean on God through rejection and pain. While he'd closed himself off, she'd kept her heart open to love despite cruel judgment. The storm drummed on the roof as Patricia finished her prayers and climbed into bed. Ronald stayed awake long after her breathing settled into sleep. He watched dawn slowly illuminate the windows, thinking about faith and strength and the different ways people carry their burdens. As the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, Ronald made a silent vow. He would protect not just his land, but Patricia's dignity. He would stand against Langley's lies and the town's cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, he would learn to pray again, because Patricia had shown him something he'd forgotten, that true strength isn't in never falling, but in rising again, in keeping faith when the world turns cruel, in choosing love over bitterness. The morning light caught Patricia's face as she slept, peaceful despite yesterday's wounds. Ronald felt humbled by her quiet courage and more determined than ever to be worthy of it. The autumn wind carried smoke before Ronald saw the flames. He was riding back from the north pasture, tools clanking in his saddlebag, when the acrid scent hit him. His heart stopped. There, against the darkening sky, orange, flames licked up from his barn's wooden walls. "Patricia!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward. She was already there, struggling with a heavy bucket of water from the well. Her face was streaked with soot, her dress soaked with effort. The cattle broke free, she called out, voice hoarse from smoke. "I got them into the far field." Ronald leaped from his horse and grabbed a spare bucket. Together, they formed a desperate line between well and barn, passing water back and forth. The heat pressed against them like a living thing, hungry and cruel. Sweat ran down their faces as they worked, knowing it was hopeless but unable to stop trying. With a thunderous crack, the barn's main beam gave way. The roof collapsed inward, sending a fountain of sparks into the twilight sky. Patricia screamed, dropping her bucket. She fell to her knees in the dirt. "Your hay," she sobbed. "Your tools, the wagon, everything you've worked for. And it's my fault. My fault." Ronald knelt beside her, confusion cutting through his despair. "Langley did this because of me," Patricia choked out. "Because I'm here. Because I brought shame and trouble to your door. If I hadn't, stop." Ronald's voice was firm but gentle. He gathered her into his arms, not caring about the soot or tears. "You haven't brought me ruin, Patricia. You've brought me hope." She looked up at him, disbelieving. "Before you came," he continued, This was just land and buildings, empty, cold. But you, he struggled to find the words. You brought life back, light in the windows, bread in the kitchen, prayer in the evening. That's worth more than any. Barn. They stayed there as the flames died down, holding each other while their world smoldered around them. Dawn found them exhausted, dragging charred beams into a pile. Every muscle ached, but they couldn't rest. Winter was coming, and they needed shelter for the remaining supplies. The sun was high when Marita appeared on the trail, carrying a heavy basket. Without a word, she set out corn cakes, dried meat, and her special healing tea. You are not alone, she said simply, helping them clear debris. The people remember kindness. We stand together against evil men. That evening, bone-weary, they sat on the porch steps. The ruined barn was a black skeleton against the sunset. But when Patricia shivered, Ronald took her hand in his. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, warm and sure. No words were needed. The gesture said everything. Whatever shame Langley tried to heap on her, whatever destruction he brought, Patricia would not face it alone. They watched the stars emerge, hands still clasped as crickets sang in the darkness. The first winter storm swept down from the mountains like a hungry wolf. Icy winds rattled the cabin windows, and snow piled in drifts against the walls where the barn once stood. Patricia counted their dwindling supplies with growing concern. 3 cups of flour, half a sack of beans, and precious little else. We have to go to town, she said softly over breakfast, watching Ronald's face tighten at the words. He nodded grimly, knowing she was right. The next morning dawned bitter cold. Ronald wrapped Patricia in every spare blanket before helping her onto the wagon seat. Snow crunched beneath the wheels as they set out, the sound echoing across the empty white prairie. Their breath frosted in the air, forming tiny clouds that dispersed in the wind. The journey took twice as long as usual, the horses struggling through deep drifts. By the time they reached Ridgetop, Patricia's teeth were chattering despite the blankets. The mercantile's warm interior was a blessing, but that comfort vanished when Ezra Langley's shadow darkened the doorway. Well, if it isn't the devoted couple, Langley drawled, his smile sharp as a knife. Tell me, Mrs. McCord, has your conscience begun to trouble you yet? Living in sin with a man who barely knows you? Patricia's hands trembled as she clutched her shopping list. Ronald's shoulders squared, his jaw clenching tight. Or perhaps, Langley continued, raising his voice for the other customers to hear. You're simply waiting for spring to abandon him, like your family abandoned you. Though I suppose they had good reason. Ronald's step forward was halted by Patricia's gentle touch on his arm. Remember our covenant, she whispered, though her voice shook. Not with violence, but with faith. Langley sneered. Faith won't save your water rights, McCord. Come spring, you'll be leaving that ranch one way or another. They finished their shopping in tense silence, paying for what little they could afford. The ride home was quiet, save for the whisper of snow and the creak of wagon wheels. That night, as they sat before the fireplace, Patricia's composure finally broke. I almost ran today, she confessed, tears freezing on her cheeks. When Langley spoke those cruel words, I wanted to disappear into the snow. But you didn't, Ronald said softly. No. She met his eyes. I stayed. For you. Ronald's breath caught. He stared into the flames, his own confession rising like smoke. I'm afraid, he admitted. Not of Langley. Of this. He gestured between them. Losing my wife and child nearly killed me. To love again, to risk that pain, love is never wasted. Patricia answered, her voice growing stronger. Not when it's rooted in faith. God doesn't promise us freedom from pain, but He promises to walk beside us through it. The firelight danced across their faces as Ronald slowly opened his arms, Patricia moved into them, and they held each other, two wounded souls, finding shelter in one another's warmth. It wasn't a passionate embrace, but something deeper, a first tentative step toward healing, toward true marriage, toward love built on shared strength rather than mere convenience. The whispers reached them through Marita Langley had hired 3 gunmen from Denver. Ronald spent that evening in the barn, his hands moving methodically across the grindstone as he sharpened pitchforks and scythes into makeshift weapons. The harsh scrape of metal filled the winter air Patricia found. Him there, her lantern casting shadows on the weathered walls. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Violence will only destroy everything we've built. What would you have me do?" Ronald's voice rose sharply. "Stand idle while they take our water, our land. There are other ways prayer won't stop. Bullets." He slammed his fist against the workbench, making the tools rattle. Patricia flinched but held her ground. "Neither will more bloodshed. It will only stain this land with grief." They argued until their voices grew hoarse, neither willing to yield. Finally, Patricia turned away, tears freezing on her cheeks. Ronald spent the night in the barn, surrounded. By his sharpened implements of war, dawn broke clear and cold. Ronald emerged to find Patricia in the yard, scattering feed for the chickens. Her breath fogged in the morning air as she worked, her movements slow but steady. "You should be inside." "Where it's warm," he said gruffly. She straightened, meeting his gaze. "I won't abandon you," she said simply. "But I won't watch you throw away your soul either." The morning light caught the frost in her hair, making it shimmer like a crown. Ronald felt something crack inside his chest, perhaps, or fear. "I don't want blood on this land," he admitted finally. "It's seen enough death." Patricia held out her hand. Together, they knelt in the snow-covered yard. Ronald's voice trembled as he spoke his first prayer in years, the words rusty but sincere. Patricia's quiet amen echoed across the frozen prairie. Like a promise. The Sunday morning sun painted long shadows across the dirt street as Ronald helped Patricia down from the wagon. The church bell tolled, calling the faithful to worship. Patricia smoothed her plain dress, chin lifted despite the familiar whispers that followed them up the wooden steps. Inside, sunlight streamed through clouded windows, casting patterns on rough-hewn pews. The congregation shuffled and muttered as Ronald and Patricia took their seats. Ezra Langley sat near the front, his suit pristine, his smile sharp as a knife. Reverend Turner had just finished reading from Genesis when Patricia rose suddenly. Her hands trembled, but her voice carried clear and strong through the hushed sanctuary. "I know what folks say about me," she began, "about us, but I want to speak of covenant." She pressed one hand to her heart. "Marriage is a covenant before God. So is the promise of land to those who work it faithful and true. My husband's father filed his water rights square and legal. That's covenant too." Ronald watched in awe as his shy wife addressed the church. Her words rang with conviction, touched with the plain speech of her upbringing. The good book says truth endures forever, while lies wither like grass in summer heat. I stand here asking you all to witness. Our marriage is true, our claim is just, and God's promise outlasts any man's schemes. Murmurs of approval rippled through the pews. Several farmers nodded firmly. Langley's face flushed dark red as he lurched to his feet and stormed out. Letting the door slam behind him, Ronald reached for Patricia's hand as she sat back down. His grip said everything his heart felt, pride, gratitude, and something deeper growing between them. Around them, the townsfolk's expressions had shifted from scorn to respect. Seeing at last the quiet strength that Ronald had discovered in his wife, morning light streamed through the county. Courthouse windows as Patricia stood before the judge, her hands steady as she presented the yellow document. Ronald watched from his seat. heart swelling with pride as she explained how she had found his father's water rights filing tucked away in the old ledger. Filed 19 years ago. Your Honor, Patricia said clearly. Long before Mr. Langley's claim. The county officials leaned forward, examining the paper. Ezra Langley's face grew pale as his elaborate scheme crumbled. The judge's gavel struck with finality, declaring the McCord Ranch's legal right to the river water. Langley slumped in his chair, his reputation in tatters. Without a word, he skulked from the courthouse, leaving his hired guns unpaid and angry. Outside in the bright afternoon, townsfolk who had gathered to hear the verdict tipped their hats respectfully to Ronald and Patricia. The same people who had once whispered cruel words now offered congratulations and handshakes. Back at the ranch, neighbors arrived with lumber and tools. The sound of hammering filled the air as they raised new barn walls. Marita brought her family, sharing dried venison and stories while children played in the yard. The aroma of Patricia's fresh bread mingled with laughter and hope. As stars emerged in the purple dusk, the last wagon departed. Ronald found Patricia on the porch, her face glowing in the lamplight. He took her hands in his, voice thick with emotion. "Patricia," he said softly, "I need to speak plain. What started as a bargain has grown into love. I want you as my true wife, my partner in all things. Will you share my life, not from need, but from love?" Tears spilled down Patricia's cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, with all my heart, yes." The first snow of winter transformed the ranch into a gleaming wonderland. The newly rebuilt barn stood proud against the white landscape, while smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the McCord home. Through frosted window panes, warm lamplight spilled onto the snow, welcoming their evening guests. Inside, the house buzzed with life. Marita's family and neighboring ranchers crowded around the long table, passing steaming bowls of Patricia's hearty stew. Laughter echoed off the walls that had known such silence before. Children played in the corner, while adults shared stories of seasons past. As evening deepened, soft hymns filled the air. Ronald rose, his glass lifted high. The good Lord turned my loneliness to love, he said, voice thick with emotion, and hardship into strength. Patricia's eyes shone as she led them all in prayer, her gentle voice steady with gratitude. After the last wagon disappeared into the snowy night, Ronald and Patricia stood together on the porch. Above them, stars sparkled in the crystal clear sky. Ronald wrapped his arm around her substantial frame. "This is home," he said simply. Patricia leaned into his embrace, whispering, "And I am your wife. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me." If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.